I first noticed it in the quietest ways, the kind that almost feel like nothing, except they aren't. There was a space at the dinner table that used to be filled with him, or the small pause in conversation, when I said something he used to notice, and now he barely did. The kind of thing that doesn't look like betrayal on the surface, but the heart knows. I remember sitting on our couch one Friday evening, glass of wine in hand, scrolling through my phone, and realizing I hadn't heard him laugh in weeks. Not the laugh that used to catch my attention from across the room, the one that made the rest of the world fade a little. It's strange how silence can feel like a decision. How the absence of a gesture or a word can bruise you more than a shout ever would. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was being oversensitive. But the thought wouldn't leave me. What if I wasn't part of his world anymore, not in the way I thought I was? The first real sting came with dinner one Tuesday. He'd been distracted all evening, scrolling through his phone under the table, and I asked him something simple, about a project he was supposed to be excited about. He nodded, smiled politely, and then returned to whatever had captured his attention. There was no malice, no anger, no words that could be confronted. Just a quiet absence of me in his mind. I remember putting down my fork and feeling a weight in my chest, a slow sinking. "I don't think you're even listening anymore," I said softly, trying to keep it casual, the kind of thing you say to see if someone will meet you halfway. He looked up, startled, as though I'd interrupted a thought he hadn't meant to share. "Sorry, what?" he said, with a brief laugh that didn't reach his eyes. And that was it. He returned to his phone, and the moment passed, leaving me in a quiet, aching solitude. At first, I blamed work, long hours, stress. We were in Seattle then, a city where life moves fast enough that you can feel invisible if you aren't careful. I convinced myself he was tired, distracted, and that we were both just caught in the rhythm of living. But the feeling kept returning, creeping in during ordinary moments. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped making plans with me that weren't necessary or convenient. He stopped noticing the little things that used to be a part of our shared life. I started keeping track of the changes, not because I wanted proof, but because I needed to understand what I was feeling. The mornings were the worst. He would get up, make coffee, and leave without even a glance. I'd be lying in bed, listening to the faint sound of him moving around the kitchen, wondering when the warmth had gone from our home. I started noticing that he didn't move toward me anymore, didn't brush my hair back, didn't lean in when I spoke. Everything that used to mean connection had slowly been replaced with politeness, a hollow civility that almost disguised absence. I tried reaching out, not in an accusing way, but in the gentle way you do when you sense someone slipping away. "Want to take a walk tonight?" I asked one evening, hoping the familiar rhythm of our old routines would remind him of us. He hesitated, then said, "I think I'm going to stay in and catch up on some reading." His tone was neutral, almost cordial, and I remember feeling that quiet, relentless twist in my stomach, that knowledge that my invitation was no longer desired. It wasn't until a weekend brunch with friends that I saw it, clearly, for the first time. He was laughing, leaning close to someone I didn't recognize, telling a story that didn't include me at all. The physical space between them was small, intimate enough that the lines he'd drawn with me felt glaringly obvious. I didn't want to watch, but I couldn't look away. Everything inside me wanted to confront him, to ask, to accuse. But something deeper told me that wasn't what this was about anymore. It wasn't explosive, it was quiet, subtle, and already done. I was just noticing it. I remember driving home that afternoon, the city a blur past the window, feeling like the life we'd been building together was actually someone else's. That was the moment the thought became undeniable. He had already moved on, in small ways that had nothing to do with yelling or fighting, everything to do with absence and shifting attention. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, a phase, but the emptiness was too consistent to be anything else. We used to share a favorite coffee shop near Ballard, a small corner where the baristas knew our orders by heart. I went there alone one Wednesday morning, hoping that maybe being in the spaces where we had lived our routine might bring him back, or bring back what we had. Instead, I saw him through the window, sitting with someone else. She had his attention in the way I once had. He smiled in a way that made my chest tighten, not with jealousy exactly, but with the slow, aching recognition that my place had been quietly filled by another. It's the way he didn't notice me that hurt the most. No confrontation, no declaration, just the gentle erasure of my presence. I ordered my coffee, sat in a corner, and let the realization settle over me like the gray Seattle fog outside. That was when I understood something fundamental. The betrayal wasn't an event. It wasn't a scene. It was the accumulation of absence, the careful, almost invisible replacement that happens when someone stops choosing you, politely, over and over. I didn't say anything when I got home. We spoke as if nothing had happened. I made a dinner, we ate, we shared a show, but my mind was elsewhere. I realized I was living in a dual reality, the man I knew, who still occupied the apartment with me, and the man I saw through a window that morning, who was already someone else's. It was quiet. It was simple. And it was completely devastating. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed next to him, feeling his warmth, his familiar weight, and knowing that his mind was no longer fully mine, that he carried someone else in the small spaces where I used to live. I started to notice the patterns, the texts that went unanswered, the promises of soon that never arrived, the little habits that had shifted so imperceptibly I almost missed them until they weren't small anymore. I began to remember the early signs, the ones I'd brushed off. The missed anniversaries, the conversations cut short, the way his gaze drifted when I spoke. The way he laughed at jokes I didn't hear, smiled at moments I wasn't part of. I had excused all of it, told myself that people change, that life gets busy, that love isn't perfect. But now, looking back, I could see the quiet trajectory of my displacement, like watching a river slowly carve a canyon where once there was flat ground. And the cruelest part was how little it had looked like betrayal at the time. No fights, no yelling, no dramatic exits. Just a gradual, careful turning away, so slow and deliberate that it felt like it was my perception, my mistake, until I couldn't deny it any longer. I started to withdraw too, almost instinctively, trying to preserve some sense of self that wasn't already quietly being replaced. I stopped asking him about his day. I stopped sharing the little triumphs that used to make him smile. I let the silence between us grow, because I couldn't compete with a presence I could no longer touch. I learned to live alongside the empty spaces he had made, the parts of him that had already left. Even now, months later, I still catch myself glancing at his phone, wondering if the pattern continues, if he's still slipping into that quiet world I no longer inhabit. I catch myself remembering the times he reached for me, smiled at me, noticed me, and I realize those moments are gone, not stolen in a dramatic gesture, but quietly eroded, replaced with absence and the polite warmth of someone who has moved on without telling you. Sometimes I ask myself if I should confront him, demand a conversation, call it out. But I know it wouldn't change anything. The betrayal isn't in what he would say, it's in what he has already done, quietly, over months, leaving me to realize that the life I thought we were building together had never included me as fully as I believed. I still live in the apartment we shared. I still see him across the kitchen table, across the living room, in those ordinary moments. And I still feel the slow, undeniable ache of being replaced. It's not violent, it's not dramatic, it's just life moving forward without you, and you are left quietly noticing, quietly understanding, quietly grieving the absence that isn't even spoken aloud. And that is the weight I carry with me every day, in the subtle silences, the polite smiles, the conversations that no longer include me. The life I thought we were building, the one I believed we were creating together, was never really mine to inhabit fully. He had moved on before I even knew I was losing him, and I am left with the quiet, steady, aching awareness that sometimes the most profound betrayals are not shouted, but whispered in absence, in the spaces you once thought were shared. I remember the first time I realized I was no longer part of the decisions he made. It was subtle, like a slow leak that you don't notice until the room is half empty. We'd been planning a weekend trip to the wine country north of Seattle. Something simple, something we used to do every few months, just the two of us. I assumed he'd be excited, the way he used to get when we made plans together. Instead, he came home one Thursday evening and said, "I thought I'd try something different this weekend. Claire suggested a cabin up in Whidbey, and it sounds fun." I booked it. I froze for a moment, trying to place her name, trying to imagine who she was in relation to the weekend we had casually sketched out over dinner 2 weeks earlier. I didn't ask. Not out loud. My instinct was to back away, let the words settle where they fell. But inside, my chest was tight with the realization that the life I thought we were building had quietly been replaced, piece by piece, by someone else's suggestions, someone else's presence, someone else's laughter he'd already claimed. I went along, of course. I smiled, nodded, said, "Sounds great." It would have been embarrassing to confront him, I thought, and besides, what could I say that wasn't already obvious to myself? So I watched him during that weekend, noticing the small things, the way his attention drifted when I spoke, how his laugh sometimes didn't include me, how he seemed to measure the space between us and leave room for her even in my presence. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it so difficult. He wasn't cruel, he was just absent. An absence is a quiet thief, a slow hand that takes what you didn't even know you were holding on to so tightly. I started looking for signs in other parts of our life together. At the grocery store, he no longer asked for my opinion on the food we'd eat. At work events, he smiled politely at my colleagues, but had no spark of recognition for the small victories I used to share with him. Even the little domestic things, the laundry, the dishes, the arrangements of furniture, felt like areas I had once influenced but no longer could. He didn't consult me, didn't notice, didn't pause. I found myself retreating into the corners of our apartment, sitting on the windowsill with a book I wasn't reading, letting him inhabit the shared spaces while I measured the distance he had carved out of my world. It's strange how betrayal can feel like a physical presence. You can feel it in the air between two people, in the way silence stretches, in the way the familiar suddenly feels foreign. One evening, I was making dinner when he called my name from the living room. "Hey, I'm thinking about redecorating the office. Claire has some ideas I like." He said it casually, almost as if he expected me to join in. But the sentence landed like a stone in my chest. The office we had both worked in, that we had filled with memories and shared late nights, was now a space where my input was no longer wanted. I said nothing, put down the knife I was holding, and moved to the living room to help him pick paint swatches. I watched him lean in close to her voice over the phone, smiling at suggestions I wasn't allowed to offer. That night, I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the same slow, relentless ache I had come to know too well. The betrayal wasn't about love, or trust being broken in some dramatic way. It was about being quietly erased, about losing relevance without confrontation, about being replaced in the spaces that mattered most. I started noticing the timing of small things too. The way he would text her late at night, the way he left notes on the fridge for her when I was the one who cooked and cleaned. He didn't hide it, not really. It was all quiet and polite, just present. And I realized, painfully, that I was being asked to coexist with someone who had already taken my place in his world. Work became a refuge in some ways, a place where I could exist without the constant reminder of my displacement. I buried myself in projects, long hours, meetings, the hum of the office, trying to maintain a sense of identity that wasn't defined by his quiet absence. But even there, I couldn't escape the echoes of what I had lost. I would think about conversations I used to have with him, the shared jokes, the plans, and I would realize they were already memories, things that existed in the past tense, because he had moved on quietly, without confrontation or apology. I remember one afternoon, walking home from the office, a light rain falling on the streets of Capitol Hill, thinking about the last real conversation we'd had. It wasn't a fight, it was a routine check-in, the kind couples have, the kind I thought was normal. He had nodded politely at my concerns, smiled at my jokes, then returned to his phone. I had laughed it off, told myself I was imagining it. But now, in the rain, I understood that that was the moment he had stopped choosing me, not in a loud way, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet spaces that matter most. I tried to talk to him once, gently, about what I felt. "I feel like we've been growing apart," I said one evening, the words almost foreign to my own mouth. He looked at me, blinked, and said, "I guess I've been busy." "I didn't realize you felt that way." It wasn't denial, it wasn't argument, it was just a polite acknowledgement that, in some ways, I was no longer part of the world he inhabited. That was the hardest part. The absence of denial, the absence of defense, the absence of recognition. He wasn't rejecting me, he was moving quietly into another space, and I was only now noticing it. I started taking long walks alone in the evenings, through the quiet streets of Green Lake, letting the steady rhythm of my feet against the pavement calm the tension in my chest. I would pass couples laughing, talking, sharing little moments, and feel a pang of longing, not for confrontation, not for revenge, not even for reconciliation, but for the small, ordinary closeness I had once assumed was ours to keep. I realized the betrayal wasn't about love lost. It was about presence lost. It was about being quietly, politely replaced. Evenings at home became exercises in self-restraint. I would make dinner, pour wine, set the table, and watch him move through the apartment without noticing the effort I put in, the love I still carried quietly. It wasn't that he didn't love me, exactly. It was that he no longer chose me in the small ways that matter most, the glance, the touch, the inclusion in decisions, the consideration that quietly confirms someone still belongs in your world. I began to catalogue the small betrayals in my mind, the dinners alone, the errands he no longer asked me to join, the jokes I no longer understood, the books he read without sharing, the quiet smiles for someone else's text. It was an accumulation, a slow erosion that I couldn't stop, couldn't confront, couldn't negotiate. And that was the cruelest part. There was nothing to fix, because nothing had been broken in a way that could be mended. It was already over, in the quietest way possible. I started to distance myself, gently, almost imperceptibly. Not in anger or spite, but out of necessity. I needed to reclaim parts of my world he had quietly claimed for someone else. I took long walks in new neighborhoods, explored cafes I'd never noticed, started reading books I hadn't touched in years. I was still living with him, still sharing the apartment, but slowly, subtly, I was creating space for myself, outside the invisible world he had moved into without me. It's a strange kind of grief, this quiet replacement. No one sees it. No one calls it betrayal, because it doesn't look like drama or confrontation. But I feel it every day, in the small spaces, in the silences, in the moments that used to belong to us, but now belong to someone else. I am learning to live with the awareness, to carry the ache without letting it define me entirely. Some nights, I imagine what it would have been like if I had spoken up sooner, if I had demanded a conversation, if I had confronted the subtle, polite ways he had drifted away. But I know, deep down, that confrontation would not have changed anything. The life I thought we were building had already been quietly claimed by someone else, and I was only now noticing that I had no part in it anymore. So I learned to live beside it. To exist alongside the absence, the quiet betrayal, the polite erasure. To walk through our apartment and notice the spaces he has allowed me to keep, and accept that the rest is gone, not stolen, not dramatic, just quietly moved on from. And in that acceptance, however small, there is a clarity I didn't have before. I began noticing the little rituals that used to be ours, how they had quietly shifted. Saturday mornings were the worst. We'd always made pancakes together, me cracking eggs, him stirring batter while humming some song I'd never remember. Now, he made them alone, careful not to invite me into the kitchen, careful to let me watch from the doorway if I happened to pass by. It wasn't malicious. It was deliberate absence, a polite assertion of distance. One Saturday, I lingered in the hallway, pretending to be on my phone while he flipped a pancake with a casual flick of the wrist. I wanted to ask if he wanted help, to reclaim some small connection, but I didn't. I realized that my presence might feel like interference to him now, that I had become an optional observer in our shared life. So I retreated, sat at the table with coffee, and let him move through the space as if I were a ghost. I started thinking about all the ways love can change without saying a word. It's not always shouting, betrayal, or rage. Sometimes it's a withdrawal so gradual that you don't notice until you realize you're living in the shadows of someone else's attention. That's what this was, not an explosion, but a slow erosion of my relevance, my place, my inclusion in decisions and ordinary moments. One evening, he invited a friend over. I had never met her before, someone from work he mentioned casually, someone who seemed, in the space of one dinner, more integrated into his world than I had been in months. I set the table, poured wine, and we sat together. I tried to be present, to engage, to be polite, but I felt invisible in a way that was quietly profound. She laughed at his jokes in a way that had once been my own laughter, leaned slightly closer when he spoke, and I could feel, in every fiber of my being, that I had been quietly edged out. I left early that night, not with words, not with accusations, but with the weight of absence pressing on me. Walking home through the quiet streets of Ballard, I realized I was mourning the life I thought we were building. Not the love, not the fights, not the arguments, but the ordinary, shared life that had already been quietly claimed by someone else. The apartment felt different after that night. Every corner, every shared object, every familiar scent seemed to carry a subtle message. You no longer belong here, not in the way you imagined. I started sleeping in the guest room more often, not in rebellion, not in anger, but in self-preservation. I needed space that wasn't quietly populated by someone else in his mind, by habits and attention that no longer included me. I tried to talk to him again. Not confrontationally, not accusingly, just gently. I feel like we're distant, I said one evening, after clearing dishes we had cooked together in silence. He looked up, a polite, neutral expression. I've been busy, he said, shrugging slightly, as though that explained everything. I nodded, realizing that there was nothing more to say. The truth was already evident. I was no longer chosen in the small, quiet ways that mattered most. It's strange how betrayal can be invisible. No one can point to it and say, this was the moment. There's no fight, no confrontation, no clear turning point. Just a series of omissions, of absences, of quiet reallocations of attention and care that leave you noticing too late. That's what made it so relentless. That's what made it ache so much. I started keeping a journal, not to document him, but to record myself. I wrote about the ways I felt unseen, unheard, quietly displaced. I wrote about the small moments of connection I still clung to, moments that had survived the subtle shifts. Writing was a way to assert my existence, to remind myself that I was still here, even if he no longer fully included me in his world. I remember one afternoon, walking past a bookstore, and seeing a couple inside, arranging books for a display together, laughing in small, familiar ways. My chest tightened, not with anger, not with envy, but with the quiet recognition of what I had lost. The life we had built, the rhythm of shared ordinary acts, the small touches of inclusion, had already been ceded to someone else. And I had only just realized that the replacement had been complete, slow as it was. The nights became harder. Lying in bed beside him, feeling the warmth that was no longer fully mine, I started to notice the small ways he had shifted. The way he would glance at his phone before responding to me, the way he would plan meals for himself, subtly excluding me from the decisions we had once made together. Each small omission, each quiet exclusion, was a brick in the wall separating us, a wall I could see but not touch. I found myself retreating inward. Not dramatically, not in anger, but in subtle, practical ways. I started taking long walks through neighborhoods I hadn't explored before, picking up new hobbies, reading books I had ignored for years. I needed a world that wasn't already quietly occupied by someone else. It was not revenge. It was survival, slow and deliberate, a quiet reclaiming of self in the spaces he no longer shared. Even the simplest domestic rituals were now exercises in solitude. I cooked for myself, washed my own dishes, arranged flowers on the table without expectation of acknowledgement. And in those acts, I began to notice something I hadn't before. A quiet resilience, a subtle ability to exist alongside absence without being defined by it. I could still inhabit our shared spaces without needing his full attention. I could survive quietly, steadily, in ways he had unknowingly allowed me to discover. I thought about leaving, moving out, creating distance that would be impossible to ignore. But I didn't. Not yet. Not because I was hoping for reconciliation, not because I expected a dramatic moment of acknowledgement, but because leaving would feel like surrendering to the quiet betrayal in a way I wasn't ready to do. Staying allowed me to observe, to understand, to navigate the subtle spaces of absence and presence, and to gradually discover my own strength in the process. I started noticing how he interacted with the world outside our apartment. His attention, once so clearly directed at me, was now dispersed in polite, careful ways toward others, his colleagues, friends, acquaintances, someone new who had quietly become significant. And I realized the most profound betrayal had nothing to do with love lost, or anger, or conflict. It had to do with relevance, inclusion, and presence. He had slowly, quietly moved me out of the life we shared, without shouting, without argument, without dramatic declaration. I began to accept it in a way I hadn't before. Not joyfully, not fully, but with a calm recognition. Some things cannot be changed, cannot be argued into existence, cannot be reclaimed once absence has quietly settled. And in that recognition, I felt a strange clarity, a quiet, subdued understanding that sometimes betrayal isn't loud or violent. It's simply life moving on around you while you slowly notice you're no longer chosen. I started noticing the beauty in small moments of self-possession. Drinking my coffee alone on the balcony, reading a book I genuinely loved, walking through a park without checking the clock for shared plans. I was still living in a world that had been partially ceded, but I was learning to inhabit the spaces he no longer occupied, and in those spaces, I began to feel a quiet, restrained sense of agency. And yet, the ache never fully disappeared. Quiet betrayal is like a shadow. It moves with you, always present, a subtle pressure that reminds you of absence and loss. I would catch myself imagining small things he might say, small ways he might still notice me, and then realize, gently, that the world he now inhabited quietly excluded me in ways I could no longer claim. It was a slow, persistent realization, one I had to carry with me, day by day. Even now, as I sit here reflecting on those months, I can feel the same slow, aching recognition. The life I thought we were building, the ordinary, shared moments, the small decisions and rituals, had already been quietly claimed by someone else. And I am left with the awareness that I am living alongside absence, alongside a life that no longer fully includes me, and learning to find my own presence in the quiet spaces that remain. I am not angry. I am not dramatic. I am not seeking confrontation. I am simply noticing, slowly, steadily, the subtle reality of replacement, the quiet betrayal that moves without fanfare. And in that noticing, I begin to reclaim myself, not in the world we once shared, but in the fragments of ordinary life that remain fully mine. I remember the first morning I woke up and noticed something different, not about him, not about the apartment, but about me. I had spent months walking through this quiet, slow grief, cataloguing the small betrayals, the polite erasures, the absence that had grown so natural I sometimes forgot it wasn't always there. And yet, that morning, I felt a subtle shift, a recognition that I could exist fully, quietly, without needing him to choose me again. It didn't feel like triumph. It didn't feel like joy. It felt like space, empty, yes, but mine to inhabit. I brewed coffee, the aroma filling the kitchen, as he moved through the apartment with his usual distant politeness, and I realized I could watch without being undone. I could exist beside absence without collapsing into it. It was a small, restrained victory, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but that settles quietly into your chest. We didn't talk about it, not directly, not that morning or any other. We didn't need to. The quiet had already done the work. I noticed, with a strange clarity, that I no longer needed to seek his attention, to catch his glance, to validate my presence. He had already moved on, politely, gradually, completely. And I could finally acknowledge it without pleading, without anger, without expectation. I started reclaiming ordinary routines that had once been shared. I rearranged furniture in the living room, small shifts that made the space feel more like mine. I began making dinners I genuinely wanted to eat, not the ones I thought he might prefer. I explored small corners of the city I had ignored, cafes, bookstores, parks. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were quiet reclamations, small declarations that I still had a place in the world, even if it wasn't the one I had assumed I shared with him. Evenings were the hardest, for a long time. I would sit across from him at the dinner table, noting the subtle rhythms of his attention, the way his eyes lingered on his phone, the slight tilts of his head when he spoke, the polite tones that had replaced warmth. I no longer expected acknowledgement. I no longer reached across the table, hoping for inclusion. I simply existed alongside the quiet absence, and in that, I found a strange, restrained peace. There were moments of memory, of course. Times when I would catch a glimpse of an old habit, a laugh we shared, a phrase he used only with me, and feel that familiar ache. It was sharp, immediate, and then it faded, leaving behind the gentle ache of recognition. These weren't pangs of jealousy or longing. They were reminders of the life I had thought we were building, the shared moments that had quietly shifted out of reach. I started writing letters I never sent, addressed to him, to myself, to the life we once imagined. I would write about the subtle betrayals, the silences, the absences. I would write about how it hurt to be replaced without confrontation, to notice it only in the small spaces, the tiny gestures, the polite warmth that no longer included me. And then I would fold the paper and set it aside. Sometimes I burned them, sometimes I kept them in a drawer, as a testament to the reality I was slowly learning to inhabit. I learned to recognize the quiet gestures of my own resilience. Cooking a meal I wanted, walking alone in a neighborhood I hadn't explored, finishing a book without comment or accompaniment. I began to see that my life could contain richness, connection, and meaning even without his full presence, even without the inclusion I had once assumed was automatic. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. We never spoke about Claire directly. There was no confrontation, no acknowledgement. She existed quietly in the spaces I once occupied, politely, subtly, without fanfare. And I allowed her to exist there without envy or dramatics. I didn't resent her. I didn't want to claim him back. I simply noted the reality. I had been quietly replaced, and it was time to adjust my expectations, my habits, my world. Sometimes, I imagine what it would have been like if things had been different. If he had spoken, if he had acknowledged the shift, if I had recognized it sooner. But I know these are fantasies, quiet exercises in what might have been. The truth is far simpler, far quieter, far more human. Life moved on around me, and I had to find my place in the spaces left unclaimed. I began taking longer walks through Discovery Park, watching the water, the distant city skyline, letting the wind carry away some of the tension in my chest. I would pass families, couples, friends laughing together, and I realized that none of them were part of my story, and that was okay. My story had changed. The quiet betrayal had carved out new boundaries, new spaces, new perspectives. And in that, I could find fragments of clarity, subtle as they were. Our conversations became lighter, more superficial, but they no longer carried the weight of expectation. We spoke about errands, about the apartment, about practical things. I realized I no longer needed the depth of attention I had once sought. I had learned to exist alongside absence, to hold myself without needing him to fill the spaces he had vacated. It wasn't what I had imagined when we first moved in together. It wasn't romantic or triumphant. It was simply necessary, human, and real. I stopped measuring my life against his attention. I stopped waiting for him to notice small triumphs, small joys, small defeats. I began noticing them myself. I began taking pleasure in my own routines, my own observations, my own small victories. It was quiet, steady work, but it grounded me in a reality I had ignored for too long. That I was still here, fully, even if he no longer chose me in the ways that mattered most. Sometimes I catch myself glancing at him, noticing the distance that has become natural, the polite warmth that now surrounds another presence in his life. I feel a gentle ache, a soft reminder of what has been lost. And yet, I do not reach for confrontation, do not seek resolution, do not demand acknowledgement. I let it exist as it is, quiet, unspoken, fully human. I have learned that betrayal doesn't always come with fireworks, or shouting, or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it comes quietly, through absence, through omission, through the slow, polite replacement that leaves you noticing too late. And sometimes the only thing you can do is notice it, accept it, and begin to build your life in the spaces that remain. There are mornings when I drink my coffee on the balcony, watching the city wake up, and feel a subtle satisfaction in my own presence, in the recognition that I am still whole, still alive, still capable of existing fully, quietly, without needing him to choose me again. The ache is there, yes, a shadow that sometimes drifts close, a reminder of absence and loss. But it no longer defines me. It is a companion now, not a captor. I am learning to live beside him, beside the life we once imagined, beside the spaces quietly claimed by another. I am learning to exist without full inclusion, without overt attention, without dramatic acknowledgement. And in that learning, I find something rare and human, clarity. Not triumphant clarity, not joyous clarity, but calm, reflective clarity, the kind that allows you to notice absence without being swallowed by it. In the end, I understand this. The life we were building was already being constructed around someone else, quietly, steadily, politely. And I am left with the knowledge, the awareness, and the quiet strength to exist beside it, to inhabit the spaces I still have, and to carry on with my own life, fully, subtly, and wholly mine. I am not bitter. I am not broken. I am simply aware, quietly aware, of what has been lost and what remains. I have been replaced, softly, without fanfare, without malice. And in the quiet aftermath, I am learning to be enough for myself, to inhabit my own life with deliberate care, to find meaning in the ordinary, the unnoticed, the quietly claimed spaces of existence that no one can take from me. And so I move forward. Slowly. Quietly. Steadily. Not because the world demands it, not because he will notice, not because anyone else will witness it. But because I am still here, still breathing, still capable of living a life that belongs to me, even in the presence of absence, even after quiet betrayal has taken its place.